Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the life of a conqueror who thought the world was too small for mortal ambition. Alexander the Great didn't just march across continents. He claimed the blood of gods, turned the sea into a road, and made empires bow with a smile that could promise a feast or an execution. You probably wouldn't survive a year in his court, but it would be one unforgettable year. So, while you're getting comfortable, feel free to tap like and subscribe if this kind of calm, late-night history is your thing. And I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment with your city and what time it was when you pressed play. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The marble floor beneath your sandals is polished to a mirror sheen, but no one dares to look down. All eyes, yours included, are fixed on the figure seated on the high-backed throne, one hand resting casually on a gilded armrest, the other stroking the smooth curve of a ceremonial scepter. It is not enough for Alexander to be king anymore. Today, he is the son of Zeus, and the room has been choreographed to remind you of it. Courtiers in silk and bronze lower themselves until their foreheads nearly graze the floor. The rustle of fabric and the faint clink of jewelry fill the air, a strange music to accompany the quiet humiliation of grown men kneeling. You bend at the waist too, partly because everyone else is doing it, and partly because the alternative might end in your execution. The air is thick with incense, yet underneath it you can smell the sharp tang of sweat from those holding their bow too long. Alexander watches this theater with a faint smile, one leg drawn over the other, his calf muscle flexing like a cat, toying with the idea of pouncing. His eyes sweep the room, sharp and restless, as if weighing the sincerity of each bow. There is no crown on his head today, but the golden diadem catches the torchlight in a way that makes you think of halos on temple statues. When the oracle of Ammon declared him the son of Zeus, the announcement spread through the camp like wildfire, burning away doubt for some and igniting it in others. For the believers, every bow is a prayer. For the skeptics, every bow is a form of survival. You are not sure which you are yet, and you suspect that even if you were, you wouldn't admit it out loud. A herald steps forward, reading out the names of visiting envoys who must offer gifts at the foot of the throne. The line of them is long. Persian nobles in embroidered robes, Greek philosophers with polished speeches, soldiers promoted for valor. One by one, they shuffle forward, kneel, present their tribute, and speak in voices so soft they might be confessing sins. Alexander nods occasionally, sometimes leaning forward to touch the shoulder of the one before him. An intimate gesture that can make a man feel blessed or marked for death. You can see the strain in the faces of older Macedonian officers who remember when Alexander was simply the boy, a prince with a quick mind and quicker temper. Now they bow as if before Olympus itself. From your place along the colonnade, you notice a young page, barely in his teens, lingering just a breath too long before lowering himself. His hesitation is like a spark in a dry field. The courtiers around him glance sideways, and you feel the collective intake of air as Alexander's gaze fixes on the boy. For a heartbeat, the entire court stills, the torches flicker, and even the herald seems to swallow his next word. Then Alexander's mouth curves into a slow, almost amused smile, and he beckons the boy forward. It is not clear whether this is mercy or the opening move of a more elaborate game. The page stumbles ahead, his knees knocking together, and the king leans down to whisper something you can't hear. Whatever it is, it drains the boy's face of color before he scurries back to his place. It occurs to you then that this is as much about theater as it is about divinity. The bows, the titles, the silk banners bearing the lightning bolt of Zeus, these are props, carefully arranged to keep the audience in their places. Alexander has always been a master of performance, whether on the battlefield or in the banquet hall. But now, the stage is his court, and the performance never ends. Even in silence, you feel the weight of his presence pressing against you, daring you to misstep. A drop of sweat slides down your back, not from the heat of the torches, but from the awareness that in this place, every gesture could be the one you are remembered for, or punished for. As the audience disperses, the tension does not fade. People move in pairs or small groups, their voices low, glancing over shoulders as if the marble columns themselves might be listening. You trail behind a knot of senior officers, pretending to study the mosaics underfoot while catching snatches of their muttered conversation. Some speak of Alexander's brilliance, others of his growing distance from the men who bled for him in the early campaigns. One man says the word hubris under his breath, and another quickly shushes him, eyes darting toward the throne. You catch a glimpse of Alexander again as you pass an open doorway. He is alone now, standing before a bronze mirror, tilting his head slightly, as if studying the face of a god he is still getting used to wearing. The flicker of torchlight makes his eyes seem brighter, almost fevered, and you wonder if he believes the oracle's words as deeply as he wants everyone else to. There is something intoxicating about the certainty with which he moves, as if every step is already part of legend. The scent of wine drifts faintly from the adjoining chamber, and you hear the clatter of goblets being set out. The day's ceremony is over, but the night's revelry is about to begin. You know from experience that in Alexander's court, the distance between a toast and a quarrel is dangerously short, and the sharper the wine, the sharper the tempers it will unleash. Tonight, the gods may sit at the table, but the mortals will still be the ones spilling the wine, and possibly blood, before the night is done. The banquet begins with a chorus of clinking goblets, the bronze and silver vessels, catching the firelight as if toasting the flames themselves. You take a seat along the edge of the long table, far enough from Alexander to be safe from his direct attention, but close enough to feel the pull of his presence at the head of the feast. Platters groan under the weight of roasted meats, honey-drizzled pastries, and heaps of figs so ripe they burst at the touch. The air is a heady mix of cinnamon, smoke, and the heavy perfume of wine that has been poured far too generously into every cup. Conversation hums in patches, drifting between war stories and murmured court gossip. Somewhere down the table, a lyre begins to play a slow, meandering tune that struggles to compete with the growing laughter and raised voices. Alexander lifts his cup, not as a king, but as a comrade in arms, at least in the first few rounds. He has always been skilled at blurring the line between leader and companion when it suits him, the kind of man who will clasp your shoulder as if you were brothers before ordering you into a battle from which you might not return. Tonight, he laughs deeply, tilts his head back, and drains his wine in one long pull, the kind that inspires the men around him to match his pace. You sip yours more cautiously, remembering that the measure of this night will not be taken in how much is eaten, but in how much is remembered in the morning. Already, the shoulders of the men beside you are loosening, their words coming faster, their gestures wider. The sharp edge of caution dulls with each refill. Cletus the Black sits not far from Alexander, the two of them exchanging barbed jokes that carry the ease of long friendship. Cletus is a man who has fought by Alexander's side for years, one who once saved his life in battle. You've seen them drink together before, trading war tales until dawn. But there's a stiffness to Cletus tonight, a reluctance to let Alexander's laughter pull him entirely into its current. He drinks, but he watches, his dark eyes measuring the man who now wears both a crown and the mantle of a god. The music quickens, as if sensing the shift in the air, and the servers move faster, refilling cups before they're fully empty. It happens slowly at first, the way all dangerous tempers do. Someone mentions Philip II, Alexander's father, and the air changes in an instant. You see the flicker in Alexander's expression, the tightening at the corner of his mouth. Cletus speaks of Philip's victories, of the groundwork he laid for the empire that Alexander now claims as his own. It is a fair point, even flattering in a way, but Alexander hears it as a challenge. The laughter fades into a brittle quiet, the kind that makes even the musicians fumble for the next note. The king's voice cuts through the silence, measured at first, reminding everyone how much further he has gone, how much greater his conquests have been. His words are not shouted, but each one feels heavier than the last, like stones building a wall between the two men. Cletus replies with a kind of reckless honesty that you have only seen in those who believe they are too valuable to fall. He reminds Alexander, with a tone just shy of mockery, that he owes his life to those who fought beside him, that the empire is not his alone. The tension snaps taut. You can feel the collective intake of breath along the table, every man calculating whether to look away or lean forward. Alexander's face flushes, not just from the wine, but from something deeper, hotter. His hand grips the stem of his goblet until his knuckles pale, and for a moment, you wonder if he will simply hurl it across the table. The servants hover at the edges of the room, unsure whether to retreat or stand ready. You can hear the faint hiss of a torch guttering in the corner. And beyond that, the ragged breathing of men who have fought wars together and now find themselves in a different kind of battle. Alexander rises slowly, his chair scraping the floor in a sound that cuts through the music like a blade. His voice is sharper now, the words tumbling out faster, laced with insult. Cletus, perhaps emboldened by the wine or simply unwilling to bow, has not backed down. He leans forward, matching Alexander's heat with his own, until the air between them feels like it could ignite. It is here, in this charged moment, that you understand the true danger of drinking with Alexander. It isn't the wine itself, it's the way it lowers the drawbridge between jest and fury, turning a night meant for celebration into a siege. Around you, men stare into their cups or the table, willing themselves invisible. The musicians have stopped playing entirely, their instruments resting silently in their laps. Somewhere outside, a night wind rattles the shutters, but inside the hall, the only movement is Alexander's hand, reaching for the spear propped just behind his chair. The moment holds like the pause before lightning. You don't know yet if the storm will break here or be carried into the darker hours of the night. But the way Alexander's gaze locks onto Cletus makes it clear that this is no passing squall. Whatever happens next will not be forgotten by morning, and it will stain the rest of the night in the same deep, unshakable red. The wine still glistens in your cup, but you find you have no desire to drink from it again. Somewhere in the unsteady silence, the feast teeters on the edge of something that will change everything that follows. The first time you hear the idea, you think it's a joke. The city of Tyre sits proudly on its island, its walls jutting straight out of the sea like the ramparts of some stubborn god. And Alexander says he'll simply build a road to it. You picture the water swallowing the first stones, the tide laughing them back onto the shore. But he's serious, deadly serious. He stands on the coast in his gleaming armor, scanning the horizon as if measuring the distance with his eyes alone, and declares that the sea will be made into a bridge for his army. There's no doubt in his voice, no hint that this is anything but inevitable. And because it's Alexander, no one dares suggest otherwise. The work begins the next day. Soldiers become laborers, tearing into the earth to drag out stone, timber, and whatever rubble they can find. You join them on the shoreline, your feet sinking into the damp sand as you heave rocks into place. The sun reflects hard off the water, blinding you every time you glance toward Tyre's defiant towers. The air smells of salt and sweat, and the rhythmic splash of stones hitting the shallows begins to feel like the heartbeat of something massive and unstoppable. Within hours, your tunic clings to you, the grit of sand sticking to your skin. It's not long before your shoulders ache, but there's no slowing. Alexander stalks the worksite like a conductor urging his orchestra toward a crescendo, his words sharp enough to keep even the most exhausted men moving. At first, the Tyrians watch with a kind of incredulous amusement from their walls. Surely, this is just another siege effort. that will fade away in weeks. But the line of stone grows longer each day, a finger of land pushing into the sea, and their laughter turns to shouts and arrows. You duck more than once as projectiles arc overhead, clattering into the half-built causeway. Alexander answers with siege towers rolled right onto the growing road, their height daring Tyre to respond. Soon, the shoreline is a roar of work and war, the hiss of arrows mixing with the grunt of men pushing forward. The progress is slow, punishingly slow. Every cartload of rock must be hauled further than the last, the sea constantly trying to steal back the progress made. The water swirls around the base of the new land, tugging at boots and threatening to drag the smaller stones into its depths. More than once, you see a man lose his footing, the weight of the stone pulling him under before others rush in to haul him out. You taste salt on your lips that isn't just from the spray. It's from the sweat dripping into your mouth as you strain against another load. Some nights, you lie down to sleep and feel as if you're still swaying with the tide, your muscles rolling with the phantom motion of hauling and lifting. Alexander's energy never wanes. He moves from one part of the causeway to another, encouraging, ordering, sometimes snapping at men who falter. He wades into the shallows at times, inspecting the foundations himself, water lapping at the bronze greaves on his legs. His belief in the project is infectious, though you suspect it's not entirely about the city. This is another performance, a demonstration to the world that his will can reshape not just nations, but the very geography of the earth. If Tyre thought the sea itself would protect them, Alexander will turn the sea into a weapon. The Tyrians are not passive. They send fire ships toward the wooden towers, the flames leaping higher than the masts. The air fills with shouts and smoke, the sweet, sick smell of burning tar carried on the wind. You help drag charred timbers back to shore, your hands blackened and your throat raw. On other days, they drop massive stones into the water to block the approach, forcing Alexander's engineers to devise ways to drag them aside. But the work resumes before the smoke has even cleared. Stone by stone, the road creeps closer to the city walls, each step forward pressing harder against Tyre's pride. As the gap narrows, the defenders grow more desperate. They rain down rocks and burning oil, their curses carrying over the water. You learn to listen for the pitch of an incoming missile, to dive aside before it hits. There's a grim rhythm to it now. Haul, place, duck, and keep moving. The causeway stretches out like a scar across the blue, and in its shadow, the sea churns angrily, as if insulted by the intrusion. Then comes the day when the road touches Tyre's walls. You stand there, sea spray dampening your hair, and realize you've helped erase the island's most powerful defense. The city that once seemed untouchable now feels cornered, and Alexander's gaze gleams with the satisfaction of a hunter closing in on the kill. The men around you cheer, not just from victory, but from disbelief that this impossible thing is now under their feet. Some slap each other on the back. Others simply drop where they stand, letting exhaustion crash over them. As the siege engines roll forward and the first cracks appear in Tyre's defenses, you know the real storm is about to begin. The road across the sea was just the opening act, a prelude to whatever Alexander will unleash once he's inside those walls. And if history has taught you anything about knights in his company, it's that triumph and disaster can sit very close together, sometimes at the same table. The next time that table is set, it will be for a feast where the wine flows freely and tempers flow even faster. By the time you step into the banquet hall, the scent of roasted lamb and warm bread is already thick enough to make your stomach ache. The victory at Tyre has turned the night into a celebration, at least in name. Torches blaze in iron sconces along the walls, their light catching on bowls of figs, plates of honeyed pastries, and the polished bronze rims of serving trays. Long tables are crowded with men in varying states of dishevelment, some still smelling faintly of the sea, others wearing freshly polished armor to match the mood. The wine is flowing in great clay jugs, passed from one man to another with the careless ease of soldiers who believe the night will never end badly for them. Alexander sits at the head of the largest table, his hair damp and curling slightly from the bath he must have taken after the siege. He is smiling, leaning close to one of his generals as they share some private joke. But you've learned that a smile in this room can be the most dangerous expression of all. The king raises his goblet, and a cheer ripples down the hall, loud enough to drown out the musicians for a moment. Cups are lifted in response, and you join in because everyone else does. Now you take only a modest sip. The wine is strong and sweet, clinging to your tongue like syrup. It is the kind that makes words come faster and louder, whether they should or not. The conversation around you starts in harmless territory. Tales of the siege, exaggerated enough to make men laugh through mouthfuls of meat. But as the cups empty and fill again, the laughter grows sharper. Victories turn into arguments over credit. One man brags about being first onto the causeway. Another claims the honor belongs to his unit. Alexander watches from his seat, eyes half-lidded as though bored. But you know he misses nothing. He has a talent for letting tension build until it becomes its own entertainment. You catch sight of envoys from newly conquered cities seated along the far wall, their backs stiff, their eyes darting as if trying to follow the shifting alliances at the table. The feast is not just a reward, it's a display. Every bite, every toast, every forced laugh is part of a performance meant to remind guests who holds the power here. Alexander doesn't need to threaten anyone outright. The weight of the room does it for him. Even the servants seem to understand, moving with quiet precision, refilling goblets just enough to keep the talk flowing and the edges of civility fraying. At one point, Alexander signals for a platter of roasted boar to be brought to him. The meat is carved in silence, a knife sliding through with almost theatrical ease. He offers the first portion to a general who has recently fallen out of favor, an apparent kindness that somehow feels like a test. The man accepts with both hands, smiling too quickly, and Alexander holds his gaze for a heartbeat longer than politeness demands. You realize then that in this hall, food can be as much a weapon as any spear. The music swells again, filling the gaps in conversation with a bright, dancing rhythm. But the talk at your table has shifted into the familiar undercurrent of complaint. The length of the campaigns, the homes left behind, the constant expectation of loyalty without question. You listen without adding your own voice, aware that even a mild agreement could carry to the wrong ears. One man leans closer to you, his breath warm with wine, and mutters something about Alexander's divine pretensions. You force a chuckle, as if it's a harmless joke, and change the subject before the words can stick. Across the hall, Alexander rises from his seat, cup in hand. He begins speaking of the greatness of his army, of the destiny they share, of how their names will live on beyond marble and bronze. His voice is rich and sure, the kind that could convince you to march into the sea if he asked. Men cheer, pound the tables, call his name. But underneath it, you sense the careful rhythm of the moment, the way he praises and warns in the same breath, binding loyalty to him with threads of pride and fear. By the time you return to your seat, the platters have been stripped bare, and the last of the wine is being poured. Laughter still bursts here and there, but it's more brittle now, frayed at the edges by too much drink and too many unspoken grievances. You can feel the night tilting toward something less controlled, the way a candle leans just before it topples. Alexander catches your eye briefly, and in that fleeting glance you understand. He doesn't mind if the night turns dangerous. Sometimes he seems to welcome it. As the servants clear the tables and the musicians soften their tune, you realize this uneasy mixture of celebration and menace is the true flavor of a feast in Alexander's court. It is never just about food or drink. It is about watching who rises, who falters, and who forgets themselves in the glow of torchlight and strong wine. And somewhere in the laughter, the next quarrel is already fermenting. ready to be uncorked before the night is over. That coral will belong to men with tempers sharpened by drink, and you know exactly whose temper will blaze the brightest. Morning in the camp comes with a pale, watery light that seems to seep rather than shine. The smell of last night's wine still lingers in the hallways, mixed with the sharper tang of extinguished torches and the faint sourness of spilled meat and fruit left too long in the warmth. You keep your head low as you move through the corridors, passing servants scrubbing at sticky patches on the marble floor. The echoes of the previous evening's cheers feel almost ghostly now, as though they were spoken in another lifetime. But the name on every whisper that survives from the feast is not Cletus or Tyre, it's the Oracle. The declaration from the Oracle of Ammon, made months before, still sits in the air of the court like a fine dust that never settles. Son of Zeus, she had called him, her voice low and deliberate, each word offered as if it were too heavy for her alone to carry. Since then, the title has worked its way into the smallest corners of daily life. The soldiers mutter it when they think no one of rank is listening, sometimes with awe, sometimes with a smirk they hide quickly. In the court, it has become part of the formal greetings, as unavoidable as bowing itself. You hear it from the lips of generals who fought beside him when he was still only a prince, their voices steady, but their eyes betraying some private calculation. The change is subtle but constant. At meals, Alexander now takes his seat last, a calculated delay that makes every man at the table wait with their cups untouched. When he enters the hall, conversations halt mid-word, as though the breath of the God King himself might be required before anyone else can speak again. Even the decorations have shifted. Fewer reminders of Philip, his mortal father, and more gilded lightning bolts and laurel crowns adorning the walls. The visual language of the court has been rewritten in a matter of weeks. One afternoon you watch him during an audience with emissaries from distant cities. The room is hushed except for the faint rasp of the scribes' pens scratching at wax tablets. The emissaries kneel in the dust before him, heads bowed so low they might be praying. A servant sprinkles saffron petals at Alexander's feet, the scent curling into the air like a temple offering. Alexander listens to their petitions with the patience of someone accustomed to being told what he already knows. He doesn't raise his voice, doesn't need to. The rhythm of his speech is the rhythm of command, slow, steady, with enough pauses to make the listeners wonder if they should speak or keep kneeling. When he dismisses them with a single wave of his hand, they back away as though retreating from an altar, not a man. It isn't only outsiders who've been reshaped by the oracle's words. The rituals in the palace have taken on a more sacred cast. Meals begin with toasts not just to victory, but to Alexander's divine father. At certain hours, musicians play hymns that once belonged to the temples of Zeus, now repurposed for the court. Even the guards have been instructed to change their salutes, lifting their spears in a style once reserved for statues and shrines. You hear of one day in camp when Alexander refused to speak to an officer for nearly a week because he had forgotten to address him with the proper, divine honorific. The man eventually brought a sacrifice of incense and wine to regain favor, an apology dressed as worship. You find yourself wondering if the oracle could have imagined how far her words would stretch, or if this was exactly what she had in mind. There's a part of you that still resists the idea, still remembers the Alexander who strode into battle without waiting for omens, who laughed at superstition when it didn't serve him. But now, he wears the title like armor. It has become a tool as much as a truth, a way to demand obedience without needing to draw his sword. You see it in the eyes of those who once might have argued with him and now swallow their words before they conform. You feel it in the way people stand taller when he passes, not in defiance, but in an unconscious attempt to seem more worthy of the gaze of a god. One evening, you overhear two officers speaking in hushed tones near the stables. One swears the oracle's voice had changed when she spoke to Alexander, deepening as though something else were speaking through her. The other laughs nervously and changes the subject. unwilling to push the thought further. You walk away before they notice you, but the idea lingers. It's dangerous to dwell on such things, but even more dangerous to dismiss them outright. By now, the Oracle's declaration is no longer just a memory. It's a constant, unspoken presence in every order, every toast, every bow. It has bled into the air you breathe, so that when Alexander approaches, you almost find yourself believing it without thinking. Almost. Because even as the rituals tighten around him, you can still see the man beneath, the sharp, restless eyes, the quick, almost boyish movements when he's excited. And you know that the next time those eyes flash with temper, the God King mask will not protect anyone standing too close. When that temper comes, it won't be during a solemn ritual or a day of calculated diplomacy. It will come in the heat of wine, in the narrowing space between pride and insult, in the moment when even a God King feels the sting of mortal rage. And that is when the court will remember the other title Alexander carries, the one no oracle gave him. The city falls just before dawn. You've been awake through the night, listening to the crash of the siege engines and the deep, rhythmic groan of the walls giving way. By the time the first light bleeds across the horizon, Tyre is no longer an island fortress, but a shattered shape against the sea, its proud towers scarred and smoking. The causeway you bled and sweated over for months now runs solid beneath your boots, its stones dark with seawater and ash. Every step across feels heavier than the last, as though the sea itself is dragging at your ankles in protest. The air is sharp with salt and the acrid sting of burning wood. Ships bob in the harbor, their sails slack in the early light, their hulls creaking under the weight of plunder. Along the breached walls, Macedonian soldiers move like ants, fanning out through streets that twist and narrow into the city's heart. Somewhere ahead, the clamor of steel still rings, a final resistance refusing to accept the inevitable. You pass shattered gates, splintered ladders, the remnants of barricades built in desperation. The smell of last night's smoke clings to your hair and skin, so thick you can taste it. Alexander rides into the city, not at a gallop, but at a steady, deliberate pace, his armor catching the morning sun in a flare that forces you to squint. He surveys Tyre as if it were already a memory, another line carved into the long list of places bent to his will. People emerge slowly from doorways and alleys, their eyes wide, their hands lifted in gestures that could be surrender or prayer. He greets them with the calm detachment of someone for whom this scene is as familiar as breathing. For him, it is both victory and routine. The soldiers push deeper, their shouts echoing off stone, carrying orders and triumph in equal measure. You follow at the edge of one column, stepping over broken paving stones and past fountains that still trickle in stubborn defiance of the siege. In one courtyard, a group of Tyrian children huddle beneath a stone archway, their faces streaked with grime. A soldier passes them without a glance, his eyes fixed ahead, as though their existence is simply part of the scenery. The world Alexander creates has little room for sentiment in moments like this. The spoils begin to move almost as soon as the fighting stops. You see carts piled high with amphorae of oil, bolts of purple-dyed cloth, and bronze vessels stamped with Tyrian symbols. The famed workshops, pride of the city, are already being stripped of their tools. Alexander passes through these streets with the same measured calm, pausing only to give brief commands to his officers. Each instruction is short, efficient, and obeyed without question. It strikes you then how much of this day has been written already in his mind. The siege, the breach, the slow march into the city. Each step was part of a plan as much about what came after as what led here. The celebrations will be loud, the rewards generous, but beneath them all will run the quiet, unshakable message. Resistance is not only futile, it is temporary. Every victory, no matter how hard won, becomes a stepping stone to the next. By midday, the sunlight bounces harshly off the pale stone, turning the city into a bright, dizzying maze. The sea wind shifts, carrying the smell of fish from the harbor and mingling it with the lingering smoke. You take a moment to stand on the edge of the causeway and look back toward the mainland. From here, the road of stone seems impossibly straight, an unbroken scar across the water. Months ago, it was only a command shouted by a man in bronze. Now, it is a permanent part of the landscape. You realize that this is how Alexander works. He leaves things behind that cannot be undone, even if the people he conquers vanish. As the day wears on, the noise of conquest gives way to the quieter rhythm of occupation. Patrols move in regular loops, the markets are repurposed for military use, and the palace at the city center becomes the new seat of command. You can feel the tension ease in the soldier's shoulders, replaced with the eager anticipation of rest, food, and perhaps more wine than is wise. Alexander, however, shows no sign of slowing. The victory at Tyre is already behind him in his mind, and his thoughts have shifted to the next horizon. That evening, as the last traces of smoke fade into the twilight, you find yourself walking the new road back toward camp. The stones are cool beneath your sandals now, the sea lapping quietly against their edges. The sky is streaked with pink and gold, the kind of sunset that makes you forget for a moment the weight of conquest. But the stillness doesn't last. Somewhere ahead, a horn sounds, a summons not for battle, but for counsel. There is always another plan to hear, another campaign to prepare, another city whose name will soon be spoken in the same breath as Alexander's. The road behind you leads to a conquered city, but the road ahead will lead to far more. Lands that stretch across continents, battles that will etch themselves into the map of history, and choices that will test every man who follows him. Tyre is finished, but Alexander's story has only begun to gather its full momentum. And before long, you will find yourself standing at his side once again, watching the young king turn toward the vast sweep of the world and claim it as his own. Before the armies, before the crowns, before the whispers of godhood, there was a boy in the hills of Macedon who ran faster than his tutors could call him back. You first see him in your mind's eye not as a conqueror, but as a restless youth, thin-limbed and sharp-eyed, darting between the stables and the training grounds. He is the son of King Philip II and Queen Olympias, which means he has inherited both the expectations of a throne and the unpredictable fire of his mother's temper. Even as a child, there's a weight to the way he carries himself, as if some invisible audience is always watching. The royal palace sits high above the plains, with stone walls that keep out more than just the wind. Courtyards echo with the clang of sparring soldiers, the whinny of horses, and the shouts of servants rushing from one errand to the next. In the quieter hours, you can hear the rustle of olive trees in the gardens and the occasional crack of a bowstring from the practice field. It's here, in this mixture of noise and stillness, that Alexander begins his education, not only in the lessons given to him, but in the endless observations he collects when no one realizes he's paying attention. Philip summons Aristotle himself to guide the boy's mind, turning part of the palace into an open-air classroom, where the smell of parchment mixes with the breeze carrying the scent of pine. The philosopher arrives with scrolls tucked under his arm and a gaze that seems to measure not only Alexander's intellect, but his future usefulness. He teaches him rhetoric, ethics, and natural philosophy, but also the finer points of strategy, diplomacy, and the inner workings of foreign courts. For Aristotle, this is not just a boy to be educated. This is a ruler in the making, and every lesson is a stone in the foundation of an empire yet to come. Alexander, however, is not content to sit for hours listening to abstract theories. He wants to test ideas in the field, to ride his horse along the edges of the hunting grounds and imagine how the land might be defended. His favorite moments are the ones when Aristotle relents and takes the lesson outside, pointing at the horizon to explain the arc of the sun, or kneeling beside a stream to show how water shapes the earth. These lessons linger more than the ones given indoors, perhaps because they match Alexander's need to move, to see, to conquer even the quiet act of learning. There is a well-known story from this time, one told so often in Macedon it has almost become myth. As a boy, Alexander is presented with Bucephalus, a massive and unbroken horse that no one can mount. The animal shies and bucks at every attempt until the young prince notices it's afraid of its own shadow. Turning the horse toward the sun so that the shadow falls behind, Alexander calms it and mounts in one fluid motion. The court watches, stunned, as the boy rides away, his hands steady on the reins. His father, Philip, is said to have told him, "My son, find a kingdom equal to yourself. Macedon is too small for you." Historians still wonder how much of the tale is truth and how much is a crafted omen, but in either case, it sticks because it fits. Olympias, his mother, adds her own layer to the boy's education. She is deeply devoted to the cult of Dionysus and steeped in the mysteries of the gods, filling Alexander's early years with rituals, stories of heroes, and the suggestion that divine blood runs in their family. It's not a stretch to imagine these seeds taking root, influencing the man who would later accept the oracle's declaration without flinching. If Aristotle gave him the tools to reason, Olympias gave him the language of destiny. Life in the royal court is never still. There are hunts in the hills, where Alexander learns to ride for hours without tiring, and nights spent listening to the warriors in his father's service speak of campaigns past. He asks questions constantly about formations, supply lines, and how to hold the loyalty of men who have nothing but their sword and their pride. Once, he is said to have startled an old officer by reciting an entire troop roster from memory, including which men were injured in the last battle. The answers he gets are practical, but even then you can see him shaping them into something larger, storing them away for a future. Only he seems to sense. It is in these years that Alexander begins to balance two worlds: the disciplined, reasoned one Aristotle tries to instill, and the instinctive, almost reckless one that drives him to test his limits. He reads of Achilles and Heracles, not just as figures of legend, but as blueprints for living boldly. He starts to believe, perhaps genuinely, that greatness is a matter of will as much as circumstance. Around him, the palace guards see the same boy they've always known, but sharper, more certain. Those who train with him begin to realize he is not simply learning to fight, he is learning to lead. The shadow Aristotle casts over Alexander is long, and it shapes him in ways that will echo for decades. Even as a grown man, marching at the head of armies, he will quote the philosopher's words, sometimes with reverence, sometimes as if testing whether they still fit. But for now, in the flickering torchlight of the palace halls, he is still the boy who carries a philosopher's voice in one ear and the call of the horizon in the other. The horizon, however, is beginning to shift. Soon the open-air classrooms will be replaced with war councils, and the careful rhythms of study will give way to the raw urgency of succession. The boy in the philosopher's shadow is about to step into the full light of a crown, and in that light there will be no room to turn away. The moment comes faster than anyone expects. One day, you are in the court of Philip II, the air thick with the familiar mix of ambition and rivalry. The next, the king is dead, cut down by an assassin's blade during the celebration of his daughter's wedding. It happens in the open, before the eyes of the court and foreign envoys, the shock traveling through the crowd like a shudder through water. No one moves at first, not the guards, not the guests, because the death of a king in such a public, sudden way feels like a tear in the order of the world. Alexander is 20 years old when he steps into the breach. 20 years old and already carrying himself like a man who has been waiting for this exact moment his entire life. The body of Philip is barely cold when the palace begins to shift around him. Doors close, voices drop, messengers move through the corridors like hunting dogs catching a scent. Everyone knows that succession is not guaranteed, no matter what the laws or the late king's intentions say. A crown can be stolen, bargained for, or simply seized. Alexander knows this too, and he moves with a precision that leaves no room for hesitation. His first actions are as much about theater as they are about politics. He appears before the army in full armor, not as a grieving son, but as their commander. The soldiers, men who have fought under Philip for years, watch the young prince with measuring eyes, weighing the memory of the father against the promise of the son. Alexander does not plead for loyalty. He demands it, invoking not only his bloodline, but his victories in the field. Small, though, they are compared to Philip's. He reminds them that he, too, is a warrior, that he has bled beside them, that his hand has never trembled on the hilt. When he finishes speaking, there is a pause, and then the sound of spear butts striking the ground in unison. It is not universal, not yet, but it is enough. Securing the army is only the beginning. The Macedonian court is a nest of ambitions, and there are other claimants, some with blood ties, others with enough influence to try their luck. Alexander moves swiftly to remove the most dangerous rivals, summoning some to discussions from which they never return, forcing others into exile before they can rally support. It is ruthless work, but in these halls, hesitation is a weakness that can kill more quickly than a blade. Olympias, his mother, plays her own part with a skill that makes even seasoned generals wary. She is said to have overseen the deaths of certain enemies herself, her loyalty to her son burning hotter than any sense of mercy. Within weeks, the opposition is broken or scattered, and Alexander is king in name as well as in practice. But the crown he wears feels heavier than gold. It is forged in the knowledge that it rests on the edge of a blade and that everyone in his orbit knows it. Macedon is strong, but its borders are restless. News of Philip's death has already reached the cities and tribes beyond, and rebellions are stirring. The Illyrians, the Thracians, the Greeks in the south, they all smell opportunity. It will take more than titles to keep them in check. Alexander wastes no time. Before the first cracks in loyalty can widen, he marched north to secure the borders, moving with a speed that catches his enemies off guard. Campaigns that should have taken months are finished in weeks, each victory reinforcing the idea that the young king is not only Philip's heir, but his equal, or perhaps more. He rides at the front, his presence in battle as much a weapon as his spear. Even in these early fights, he has the unnerving habit of appearing where the line is weakest, turning what looks like collapse into sudden triumph. In the south, Thebes tests him, believing he will not risk a direct challenge so early in his reign. They are wrong. Alexander descends on the city with such force and speed that the rebellion collapses almost before it begins. Thebes is destroyed, its people scattered, its name turned into a warning for anyone else considering defiance. It is a brutal decision, but an effective one. The message is clear. This is not a boy warming his father's throne. This is a king who will hold his kingdom together by force, if needed, and who will not hesitate to draw blood to keep his crown. Yet even in victory, there are moments when you catch glimpses of the cost. In the quiet after a battle, Alexander walks among the fallen with a gaze that lingers longer than a conqueror should. He speaks little, but there's a tension in him, as if he knows that each body is another stone in the foundation of his reign, and that the foundation is built as much on fear as on loyalty. He is still the student of Aristotle, still the son of Olympias, but the lessons now come not from scrolls or stories, but from the unblinking reality of power. When he returns to Pella, the capital, the city greets him as both a savior and a warning. The streets are hung with garlands, but the cheers carry an edge of caution, as if the people know the same temper that crushed Thebes could turn inward if provoked. The crown sits easily on his head, yet you can almost see the shadow of the blade that still hangs over it. And somewhere in that shadow, Alexander is already looking past the borders of Macedon, his mind turning to the lands beyond, where new enemies wait and new legends might be made. The peace he has carved here will not last. It was never meant to. For Alexander, this crown is not the end of a struggle. It is the first step towards something vast enough to match the kingdom his father once told him to seek. The blood it costs to win will be nothing compared to the blood it will take to keep. The war with Persia begins not as a sudden leap, but as a deliberate stride, each step placed to make the next one inevitable. The great king's empire stretches across deserts, mountains, and seas, a vast expanse that has swallowed entire nations without faltering. But to Alexander, it is not an unassailable world. It is a challenge. The murder of Philip and the rebellions that followed have sharpened him. Now he turns his gaze east, toward the richest empire on earth. It is a gamble that would make most rulers pause. Alexander does not pause. He gathers his army, not merely as soldiers, but as the instrument of a story he intends to write across 3 continents. The first test comes at the river Granicus. The Persian satraps, confident in their numbers and their cavalry, take up position along the far bank. The water runs cold and swift, its surface breaking into silver flashes under the morning sun. The current is treacherous enough to pull a horse sideways, but Alexander rides to the front, the plumes of his helmet shaking with each step of Bucephalus. The sensible move would be to wait, to force the Persians to cross, but Alexander has never been in love with the sensible move. He tips his spear toward the far bank, shouts a command that cuts through the roar of the river, and charges. Hooves churn up icy water, shields lock into place, and the air is filled with the harsh ring of bronze on bronze. Somewhere in the melee, a Persian noble strikes for Alexander's head. The blow glances off his helmet, denting it but leaving him grinning, as if the gods themselves had just applauded. By the day's end, the Persian line is broken, their commanders dead or scattered, and the road into Asia Minor lies open. Victory builds momentum. At Issus, hemmed in between the mountains and the sea, Alexander faces Darius III himself. The Persian king's army sprawls across the narrow plain, a living tide of spears, chariots, and bowstrings drawn taut. The noise is a low, constant thunder, thousands of voices, the drumming of hooves, the metallic clatter of weapons shifting in restless hands. The wind carries the mingled smells of salt water and trampled grass. Alexander surveys the field, finds the weak point in Darius's line, and drives his cavalry into it like a wedge. The companions crash through, splitting the Persian force in 2. In the chaos, Darius abandons his chariot and flees, leaving behind not only his treasury, but his mother, wife, and children. Alexander treats them with courtesy, even insisting they keep their royal titles, a gesture that surprises the court, but fits his habit of blending magnanimity with conquest. But for all the triumph, the march east is a road paved with the dead. Each new victory leaves behind cities littered with the detritus of war, broken shields, burnt rafters, and graves dug in hurried silence. The army moves like a tide, and tides do not choose what they carry away. You pass villages where the smoke from collapsed homes still rises, markets where fruit rots on overturned stalls, and stretches of road where the only sound is the cawing of scavenger birds. At night, the campfires flicker over faces still raw from loss, and the smell of wood smoke cannot quite mask the other, heavier scents carried from the battlefield. Then comes Gaugamela. This is not just a battle. It is the gamble for the Persian Empire itself. Darius has chosen his ground well, a vast, flat plain scoured smooth, so his scythed chariots can sweep through unhindered. His army outnumbers Alexander's by tens of thousands, their banners rippling across the horizon like waves of color. The chariots gleam under the sun, each fitted with blades meant to slice through the Macedonian lines. Before the fighting begins, Alexander walks the length of his army, speaking to men by name, reminding them of their past victories. When the clash comes, it is a storm. The Persian chariots charge, but Alexander's men open their ranks to let them pass, cutting down drivers as they wheel back in confusion. The king feigns retreat on one flank, drawing Darius into overstretching his line, and then, like a bowstring snapping, he charges straight into the gap, cutting for the heart of the Persian position. Once again, Darius flees, and this time the empire flees with him. Babylon opens its gates without resistance. Persepolis follows, its palaces looted and eventually set ablaze in a fire that will burn for days. Alexander claims it as vengeance for the Persian sack of Athens a century earlier. Others quietly call it indulgence, a torch lit more for satisfaction than strategy. The gold and silver taken from Persepolis are said to be enough to pay his army for decades. The pace is relentless. Through deserts where the heat curls the air, over mountain passes where the snow stings like thrown sand, the army advances. Men who once thought Greece was the edge of the world now find themselves on roads lined with palms, in markets where the spices smell sharp and strange. Yet for every new wonder, there is another grave dug by the roadside. Another story passed around the fire about a friend who fell somewhere behind them. The bridge they are building is not of stone or timber. It is a bridge of bodies, a human span stretching from the Aegean to the heart of Asia. And still, Alexander is not finished. His gaze turns further east, past the edges of Persian maps, to lands the army has only heard of in stories. To follow him now is to accept that the campaign has no clear end, only the next horizon. The victories at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela have bound the army to him, but the bond is sealed with the knowledge that each step forward will demand a price, and the price will almost always be paid in blood. By the time Alexander enters Babylon, the dust of battle has settled into something else entirely. The city opens its gates to him, not as a fortress to be broken, but as a prize to be claimed, and he walks its streets like a man inspecting the furniture in a home he has just purchased. Babylon is unlike anything the Macedonians have seen. Broad avenues lined with towering palms, temples that smell of incense instead of sweat, and walls so thick they could hold an army on their own. For the men who have marched for years, it feels almost like a mirage. For Alexander, it is an opportunity. The Persian Empire, for all its defeat, is still rich with traditions, rituals, and systems of governance. Alexander does not simply sweep these away. He begins to weave them into his own rule. Persian satraps remain in place, now answering to him, their authority reinforced rather than erased. He adopts elements of their ceremonial dress, robes of fine silk, jeweled belts, the tall, stiff crowns that give him an even greater height. The first time he appears before his Macedonian officers in this attire, there is a murmur along the line, part curiosity and part unease. The king who once shared their dust now stands before them draped in another people's symbols. He goes further. In court, he begins introducing Persian customs, most controversially, the act of proskinesis, a formal bow or prostration before the ruler. To the Persians, it is an accepted gesture of respect. To the Macedonians, it reeks of servility fit only for the gods. Some comply reluctantly, their movements stiff and eyes downcast. Others refuse outright, risking his displeasure. Alexander insists it is a way to unify his subjects under one courtly language of respect. But it is also a test, a way to see who will bend and who will break. In the marketplaces and garrisons, a quieter blending takes place. Greek artisans begin working alongside Persian metalworkers, exchanging techniques and designs. Soldiers from both sides trade words, gestures, and recipes over shared fires. You smell spices in the cooking pots that were unknown in Macedon. See Persian fabrics stitched into the tunics of Greek officers. The empire begins to taste and sound different, each city leaving a trace on the one that follows. Alexander encourages this mingling, hosting feasts where Persian nobles sit alongside Macedonian generals, their conversations halting but polite. The wine flows freely, and the music alternates between Greek lyres and Persian tambourines. On these nights, the tension between cultures seems to soften, the sharp edges dulled by food, drink, and the novelty of shared laughter. But when the cups are emptied and the guests depart, you can still feel the fault lines beneath the surface. The Persians know their places at the table are granted, not guaranteed. The Macedonians still measure every courtesy against the memory of battles fought to win this room. The most dramatic gesture comes at Susa, where Alexander arranges a mass wedding between his officers and Persian noblewomen, binding military loyalty to political alliance. He takes a wife himself, Roxana of Bactria, whose beauty is spoken of in the same breath as her sharp mind. The ceremony is grand, even by imperial standards. Rows of couples seated side by side, garlands draped over their shoulders, the air thick with the scent of flowers and roasting meat. For Alexander, it is more than romance or pageantry. It is policy. The children of these unions will have bloodlines that cross continents, binding the empire in ways no treaty could. Not everyone welcomes the blending. Some Macedonian veterans grumble that their king is losing himself in Persian luxury, trading the hard edges of a soldier's life for the softness of silk cushions and perfumed halls. They whisper that he spends more time with Eastern advisors than with the men who carried him through the dust and heat of his first campaigns. In response, Alexander moves between worlds, one day in a Persian robe, the next riding out in armor, reminding the army that he can still lead from the front. You begin to notice how quickly he shifts between roles. In the throne room, he is a Persian king, accepting petitions with a solemn nod. In the barracks, he is the familiar commander, quick with a laugh and a hand on the shoulder. At a feast, he is the unifier, speaking in two tongues and raising a cup to both. It is a performance as much as a policy, and Alexander plays it with the ease of someone who understands that appearances can hold an empire together as tightly as walls and garrisons. Still, the strain shows in moments when he thinks no one is watching. A pause between audiences, when his gaze drifts toward the maps spread across the table, the hand resting on his sword, hilt as if to remind himself that the road is not finished. Because blending cultures is only part of his plan. The rest lies further east, in lands still beyond his reach. The empire he is building is not just a collection of cities. It is a tapestry of customs, languages, and loyalties, stitched together with both care and force. Whether it will hold when the stitching hand is gone is a question for the future. For now, Alexander's eyes are already fixed past the edges of the known map, toward a horizon that promises both new wonders and new enemies, and the army that will have to carry him there. By the time the dust of his Persian victories has settled, Alexander no longer walks into a room. He arrives like a shift in the weather. Conversations drop into careful silences, glances are exchanged, and even the air seems to adjust itself, as if aware of the danger of moving too quickly around him. He has become more than a king. He is a figure so elevated that every approach, every word is calculated. That elevation protects him from open challenge, but it also isolates him in ways that no wall or guard could. The court is no longer a place of easy camaraderie. It is a stage where every gesture has weight, and the players understand that a single misstep can end their part in the performance. His officers, men who once fought beside him as equals, now measure their words with a care that makes casual conversation nearly impossible. Even in private, the tone is different. Jokes are softer, deference more pronounced. The warmth that once came easily between him and his companions has cooled into something ceremonial, like the way one might speak to a sacred flame. It's not that Alexander has turned cold. In fact, he can still be quick to laugh, quick to place a hand on a soldier's shoulder and ask about his family back home. But those moments are brief and unpredictable, scattered between long stretches of formality. The closer someone gets to him now, the more they are forced to balance on the knife's edge between familiarity and reverence. Too casual, and it can be taken as disrespect. Too stiff, and it risks seeming insincere. Either can end a career or a life. The change is felt most keenly at the feasts, which used to be rowdy gatherings where wine loosened tongues and old friends sang over one another. Now, each goblet poured is as much a test as an offering. The tables gleam with polished bronze platters, but the conversations that once bounced freely from one end to the other now creep cautiously between neighboring seats. A careless remark about strategy, a poorly timed comparison to Philip, a hint that Alexander's conquests have come at too great a cost. These are the sparks that can ignite the temper everyone has learned to fear. The death of Cletus is the unspoken warning hanging over every table. No one needs to tell the story anymore. It sits in the air like smoke. Among the rank and file, the transformation takes on a different tone. Soldiers still cheer him on the field, still speak of his courage and skill with a kind of pride. But there's a new edge to their loyalty. They follow him into battle because he wins, because he fights where the fighting is thickest, but also because they understand that stepping out of his shadow is as dangerous as standing in it. Some still try to approach him with the easy familiarity of earlier years, bringing him small tokens from home or stories from the march. Sometimes he smiles and accepts them. Other times, his eyes glaze over, and the soldier is waved away without a word. For the foreign nobles drawn into his orbit, the untouchable aura is both a shield and a snare. Persian lords and satraps bow lower than they ever did for their own kings, draping their loyalty in elaborate oaths. They present him with gifts so rich they could ransom entire cities, gilded weapons, rare animals, gemstones the size of a fist. Alexander accepts them all with the poise of someone accustomed to the tribute of empires. But every gift deepens the unspoken truth. They serve him not out of love, but out of the knowledge that his reach extends to every corner of their world. His growing caution seeps into the smallest rituals. The guards who flank him at meals are rotated more often than before, each one searched beforehand, as if even their loyalty might shift without warning. Food tasters precede every course, sampling the meat, the wine, the honey cakes, and nodding before the plates are allowed to touch his table. The precautions are discreet, but constant, and they remind everyone that in this court, suspicion is part of the architecture. What no one says aloud is that untouchability comes with its own kind of fear. The fear that one day even the most loyal ally might be seen as a threat. Whispers about plots and betrayals swirl constantly through the court, sometimes based on truth, more often on nothing but suspicion. Men vanish from the halls without explanation, their absence noted only in the sudden reassignment of their duties. Those who remain learn quickly that survival depends on reading the smallest shifts in Alexander's mood, on anticipating what will please or anger him before he ever speaks. And yet, for all the caution and calculation, there is still a magnetism to him that no one can deny. The same force that keeps people at arm's length also draws them in, compels them to seek his approval, to be part of whatever history he is shaping. It is the paradox at the center of his reign. The closer you get to the fire, the more you risk being burned, but the warmth is too compelling to resist. This balance between fear and admiration, between intimacy and distance, will follow him into every camp, every city, every hall where he holds court. It is both a strength and a vulnerability, for a man who can no longer be touched in spirit may one day find himself alone in ways even he did not intend. And as the army prepares to push deeper into the unknown, that loneliness will not slow him. If anything, it will drive him forward toward the next horizon, where new victories might fill the space that friendship once did, and where the cost of remaining untouchable will only grow heavier. From the moment Babylon's gates swing open for him, Alexander treats the city not just as a prize of war, but as a staging ground for something far larger. The ancient capital of Mesopotamia becomes a resting point for his army, a place where the dust of years-long campaigns can settle, if only for a short while. The streets are broad and busy, lined with merchants selling goods from as far as India and the edge of the Mediterranean. The air is thick with smells both familiar and foreign. Roasting meat from street stalls, incense drifting from temple doors, the faint copper tone from the workshops of bronze casters. The soldiers wander the markets, their armor catching the sun as they finger-dyed cloth, and sample spiced wine, their voices mixing with the languages of traders who have seen more maps than battles. For Alexander, Babylon is a treasury of possibilities. He spends his days in the palace, meeting with envoys and advisors, poring over maps that stretch far beyond Persia's borders. It is said he even orders parts of the city repaired and restored, not for the sake of the Babylonians, but because he intends to keep it as one of his capitals, a jewel set in the crown of his empire. In the evenings, he walks the hanging gardens, the air cooler among the terraces, and speaks with philosophers and astrologers. Some say he asks them about the lands beyond the known world, about rivers that run red with silt and mountains so high their peaks vanish into clouds. But Babylon is not the final destination. The army's rest is brief, and soon the march resumes, first east to Susa, then Persepolis, and then further still. At Persepolis, the wealth of the Persian kings is laid bare. Storerooms piled with gold ingots, jeweled cups, and carved ivory boxes. The palaces are vast, their columns rising like petrified forests. It is here that Alexander makes the decision that will be debated for centuries: to burn the royal palace. Some say it is revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens. Others whisper it is the wine speaking, the king caught up in a night of feasting and provocation. The flames lick the columns and consume the roof beams, sending sparks into the night sky as if the stars themselves are scattering. From the ashes of Persepolis, the march continues. The land grows harsher the farther east they go. In the Jedrosian desert, the sun burns so fiercely that men drink their own ration before midday and stumble in the heat, their armor like ovens against their skin. The wind lifts sand in sheets, stinging eyes and filling mouths until speech becomes a rasp. Yet Alexander pushes on, riding at the front as if to prove the desert can be beaten through will alone. There are moments when the column looks more like a pilgrimage than an army, a moving line of weary figures chasing a vision only one man can see clearly. India is the next horizon, reached through rivers swollen with monsoon rains and forests that steam in the midday heat. At the Hydaspes River, Alexander faces King Paris, whose war elephants stand like living fortresses, their tusks capped with iron. The battle is unlike anything the Macedonians have faced. The earth shakes under the charge of elephants, and the air fills with the trumpeting of beasts and the cries of men. Alexander wins, but it is a victory edged with respect. He restores Porus to his throne, granting him territory in exchange for allegiance. It is one of the rare moments when conquest comes with generosity rather than ruin. But the further they march, the heavier the cost becomes. The men begin to murmur of home, of the years spent away from Macedon, of the graves they've dug in foreign soil. Even Alexander's closest companions feel the strain, the endless push toward the ends of the earth, testing their loyalty. When they finally reach the Hyphasis River and refuse to go farther, it is the first time the king is forced to turn back. He does it reluctantly, his face a mask that hides the churning inside. In his mind, there are still more worlds to conquer, but the bridge of bodies behind him is long, and the living who carry it forward are growing fewer. The return march is no victory parade. Storms wreck supply ships, and the desert takes more lives than battle ever did. By the time they re-enter Babylon, the army is smaller, hardened by both triumph and loss. The city greets them again with its high walls and bustling streets. But this time, there is a sense of finality in the air, as though the world beyond has been stretched as far as it can without tearing. Alexander walks through his capital with the same deliberate stride, yet there is a new weight to it. The campaigns have carved his name into the edges of the known map, but they have also left him surrounded by questions about the unity of the empire, about loyalty in the far provinces, about the strange, persistent rumors that follow him wherever he goes. And in Babylon's courts, among the columns where shadows lengthen at dusk, those whispers are growing louder. They speak of signs and omens, of divine tests and mortal limits, and of mysteries that will cling to his story long after he is gone. Before long, those mysteries will take center stage. Knots that can't be untied with swords, rivers said to promise immortality, and the final days of a king whose body would defy the very laws of decay. The world has seen his conquests. What comes next will decide how they remember the man. You arrive in Gordium on a day when the winter clouds hang low and heavy, pressing the light into a muted silver. The town smells faintly of sheep wool and damp straw, its streets uneven with ruts carved by years of cartwheels. Macedonian banners flutter alongside the older, sun-bleached flags of Phrygia, the fabric whispering against the wind. Merchants have closed their stalls, not because of the weather, but because there is a gathering in the temple courtyard, a spectacle no one wants to miss. At the heart of it sits an ancient wooden chariot, its frame dark with age, its wheels cracked and worn smooth by time. The yoke is bound to the pole by a knot so thick and intricate that it looks less like rope and more like a clenched fist carved from the very air. This is the Gordian knot, a relic tied centuries ago by King Gordius himself, the farmer turned ruler who, according to legend, rode this chariot into the city and was crowned on the spot. The knot has survived countless winters and wars, guarded as both treasure and trial. Prophecy says that whoever can untie it will go on to rule all of Asia. You stand among the crowd as Alexander steps forward, his cloak trailing just enough to catch the edge of the muddy ground. His eyes fix on the knot with a hunter's focus, the same look you've seen before a cavalry charge. He moves around it slowly, his fingers brushing over the surface, tracing the loops and coils. Up close, the craftsmanship is remarkable. Strips of bark twisted together, hardened with years of dust and oil. No visible ends to pull, no weakness to exploit. The onlookers murmur in a dozen dialects, some curious, some skeptical, a few eager to see the young conqueror humbled by rope. Alexander tugs at one loop, then another. The knot holds fast, unmoved by patience or strength. He crouches lower, peering into the shadows between the cords, perhaps looking for a trick. You imagine him weighing the options in that quick, restless mind of his. Work at the problem until his fingers blister, or find another way entirely. The prophecy says it must be undone. It does not say how. Without warning, he straightens, reaches for the hilt at his side, and draws his sword. There is no speech, no declaration, only the clean, sudden sound of steel slicing through bark and leather. The knot falls apart in two neat halves, the severed cords swaying slightly before coming to rest against the yoke. The courtyard inhales sharply. Some gasp in admiration. Others mutter that this is not what the gods intended. But Alexander only wipes his blade and sheaths it, his expression unreadable, as if he has simply completed a small necessary task. That night, the story spreads like spilled wine across the camp. Around the fires, soldiers reenact the moment with exaggerated sweeps of imaginary swords, laughing at the simplicity of it. Why waste time untying it? One says. If you can cut it, you've already proved your master. Officers, however, speak in quieter tones. Some admire the boldness. Others wonder if it reveals an impatience that could be dangerous. Among the local priests, the debate is even sharper. Was the prophecy fulfilled or defied? Historians will one day quarrel over the truth. Some will claim Alexander did untie the knot through clever manipulation, that the sword was added later to make the story more dramatic. Others will stand by the cut, arguing that the act itself is what mattered. In both versions, the moral is the same. Alexander refuses to be bound by tradition when speed and decisiveness can win the day. It becomes the first in a long list of tales where the method matters less than the result, and where obstacles are measured by how quickly they can be removed. You notice in the days after that, the phrase cutting the knot starts to creep into the army's language. A stuck wagon wheel? Cut the knot. A dispute over rations? Cut the knot. It becomes shorthand for Alexander's philosophy. When faced with a barrier, act boldly and let others debate the fine points afterward. Even in the markets, merchants repeat the tale to customers, some with pride, others with a shrug, as though they're already used to this king bending the rules of legend. Yet the knot leaves more than a story in its wake. It leaves an expectation. The prophecy's promise of ruling Asia now clings to Alexander like a second cloak, one woven from ambition and inevitability. The men begin to speak of future victories, as if they are foregone conclusions, each new campaign framed as another step toward fulfilling what was always meant to be. It's intoxicating, this sense of destiny, but also heavy. Once you've claimed the prophecy, you can't walk away from it without looking like a man who broke his own word. When the army moves out of Gordium, the winter light is already thinning toward evening. The chariot remains in the temple, but the knot is gone, its cords kept as relics or talismans by those who saw the moment. The road ahead feels somehow steeper, the horizon wider, as if the act of cutting through prophecy has invited the gods themselves to watch what comes next. Alexander rides at the front, his horse's hooves crunching over frost-hardened ground. His gaze is fixed not on the road, but on something far beyond it, a river whispered about in half-myths, said to grant immortality to those who bathe in its waters. Whether it's a place of miracles or just another battlefield, you know he'll treat it the same way he treated the knot. Approach it, test it, and if necessary, break it open by force. The road to the river is nothing like the glimmering processions painted on palace walls. It's mud, tangled reeds, and insects that bite through wool. The water ahead is said to be touched by gods, its current flowing from the edges of the world where mortals are not meant to tread. You've heard the stories before, each retelling more embroidered than the last, but the core remains the same. Drink from it or bathe in it, and your life will stretch beyond the reach of normal men. Alexander rides ahead on Bucephalus, silent for once, eyes fixed on the glint of water between the trees. Even the men behind him have dropped their usual banter, as though too much noise might shatter whatever spell he's chasing. When you finally reach the riverbank, it's not the sparkling ribbon of myth, but a wide, slow-moving expanse, the color of hammered bronze. The surface is broken by patches of water lily and drifting twigs, and the smell is a heady mix of wet earth and something metallic, like coins left too long in the rain. Alexander dismounts, strips off his armor piece by piece, and stands at the edge as though measuring the weight of eternity in the sluggish flow. The camp holds its breath. He steps in slowly, the water lapping at his calves, his thighs, his waist, until the river swallows him to the chest. You can almost imagine the ripples turning to rings of gold as they spread outward. He closes his eyes and sinks beneath the surface, vanishing into the murky light. A few of the officers exchange uneasy glances. Immortality, after all, is a risky bargain. When he emerges, water streaming from his hair and beard, there's something in his expression that's almost triumphant, almost defiant, as if he's just dared death to try him. He stays there for a while, the river curling around him, until the moment stretches so long that you wonder if he plans to live out the rest of his days waist deep in this current. The murmurs start low. Some men kneel and dip their hands into the water, rubbing it over their arms, as if a thin sheen of immortality might cling to their skin. Others hang back, suspicious, recalling old warnings that such rivers can gift life, but also steal it. A grizzled veteran from Pella spits into the current and mutters that no water, however holy, can keep a spear from finding your ribs. Still, you notice how his eyes linger on the slow eddies curling away from Alexander's body. Alexander's voice finally breaks the spell. He calls for vessels, orders the water to be stored in amphorae, to be carried with the army like a talisman. You're given a jar to hold, its damp clay cool against your palms, and you wonder if the weight you feel is more than just liquid. In the evening, campfires flare along the river's edge, and the men eat in half-silence, glancing often toward the dark outline of their king's tent. Inside, Alexander is said to be pouring the sacred water over his hands before touching his food, as if even a sip of wine must be blessed by the river's ghost. Later, you find him sitting alone on a boulder near the bank, his cloak wrapped loosely around his shoulders. The moon paints a dull silver road over the surface, and he stares at it like a man seeing the path to something he can't quite reach. He doesn't notice you at first, or maybe he pretends not to. You wonder if he feels any different, if the river's promise has taken hold in his blood, or if he's simply decided that believing in it is enough. A soft breeze stirs the reeds, carrying the faint splash of fish breaking the water, and for a moment, it's easy to imagine the current bending around him, as it would a stone that will never erode. By morning, the camp is restless. Some men swear they dreamed of endless days under a blazing sun, marching on without fatigue, their limbs strong and their wounds healed. Others waked pale and sweating, claiming visions of being trapped in a body it could never die, watching centuries pass like clouds. Alexander, if he dreamt it all, gives no sign. He mounts Bucephalus, gestures for the column to form, and leads the way without a backward glance. The river disappears behind you, swallowed by trees and distance, leaving only the damp jars sloshing in the baggage train and the uneasy question of what you've all taken with you. As the march begins, the road ahead seems both endless and urgent, as though time itself has loosened its grip on the company. You can't tell if it's the river's magic or simply the echo of a shared illusion, but the men walk taller, the dust rising in confident plumes around their boots. The drums beat steady, keeping the pace that will carry you not just across lands, but perhaps into legend itself. And yet, in the quiet space between each thud, there's an unspoken thought, whether Alexander's quest for forever will protect you, or demand a price none of you can yet see. The question lingers as you ride on, for the river is only one thread in the tapestry of his legend, and there are more to come. Stories that will blur the line between myth and reality, just as the next tale whispers of a king who defied decay itself. By the time you hear the story, it's already wearing the gilt edges of a miracle. Alexander has been dead for days, perhaps a week, depending on who you ask. The empire is a hive of restless wings, generals circling the throne, courtiers murmuring over maps, envoys scurrying between tents with faces carefully arranged to betray nothing. In the midst of all that plotting, one detail keeps slipping through the walls of guarded chambers and into the open air. His body, they say, hasn't changed. No pallor, no collapse, no scent of death curling out from behind closed doors. When you're finally ushered into the room, the air is heavy with incense, thick enough to stick in your throat. It's the kind of smell meant to smother something less pleasant, but there's nothing foul to hide. Alexander lies on a bier draped in crimson, his head tilted slightly to one side, as if listening for the end of a sentence you can't hear. His skin holds the same warm hue you remember from the last banquet, the same faint crease between his brows. Even his lips are set in that faintly amused curve he wore when the wine was flowing, and the room hung on his every word. The guards at the door stand straighter than usual, as though they, too, are under the spell of a king who refuses to look like a corpse. A physician nearby whispers that it's proof of divinity. Another insists it's the arid climate, the oils rubbed into his skin during the last rites. A few men mutter theories about honey sealing the flesh, a trick borrowed from eastern lands. But none of those explanations sit comfortably. The soldiers who've bled with him seem caught between awe and unease, glancing at the body as though half expecting it to sit up and demand their obedience all over again. At night, When the candles gutter low, the story grows legs. A sentry swears he saw the body's chest move, just enough to ripple the gold-threaded shroud. A kitchen boy claims he heard footsteps pacing inside the sealed chamber. The more cautious men shake their heads and tell you not to repeat such things, but you notice they sleep with one eye open, as if immortality might not be the gift everyone believes it to be. Historians still wonder if this preservation was real, or if it was carefully staged, an empire's last attempt to bind loyalty to a throne that was suddenly empty. Meanwhile, the question of what to do with him ignites fierce debate. Ptolemy wants the body taken to Egypt, where it could become the center of a new dynasty. Perdiccas insists it should remain in Babylon, the heart of his last campaign. Each argues not as a mortar, but as a man positioning a chess piece, aware that whoever controls Alexander's remains controls the symbol of his unbroken reign. All the while, the body rests unperturbed, a fixed point around which the future tilts and sways. You find yourself returning to the chamber more often than you intend. Sometimes it's to confirm what you've seen before, that there's no swelling, no slackening, no shadow of decay. Other times it's to stand in the hush and feel the strange current that seems to hum in the air, as though the man lying before you is only pretending at stillness. You try to picture him as he was, storming through gates, laughing over cups of wine, tossing a spear into the dust to mark the birth of a new city, but the image overlaps too perfectly with the one before you. On the 10th day, an envoy from the west arrives, wide-eyed and breathless, bearing news of an omen seen along the Euphrates. A lion pacing the riverbank in the moonlight, refusing to hunt, gazing east as if waiting for a master. Some take it as a sign that Alexander's spirit lingers, unwilling to leave the world it conquered. Others say the lion was just a lion, but you notice how no one says it too loudly. By the time plans are set to move the body, the preservation has taken on the weight of an unspoken order, an expectation that Alexander himself might be watching, ready to punish any who mishandle what's left of him. The soldiers tasked with lifting the bier do so with trembling hands, their faces pale despite the heat. You walk alongside, catching glimpses of his profile through the swaying folds of cloth, and it's almost possible to believe he could open his eyes at any moment, frown at the petty squabbles of his heirs, and resume the march to wherever he planned to go next. Even after the bier disappears into the glare of the courtyard, the chamber feels inhabited, as though something more than memory has been left behind. The air seems lighter without the body, but also emptier, and you wonder if the lack of decay was a gift to inspire or a curse to haunt. In any case, the generals are already turning their minds to the next campaign. This one fought not with armies, but with symbols, secrets, and the fragments of a god-king's legacy. That legacy, like the man himself, refuses to lie quietly, and it will follow you into the grand halls of the empire, where power now wears a dozen different faces. The first thing that strikes you is the weight of the air. It isn't the stifling heat of the desert or the smoky tongue of a battlefield camp. It's the richness of 100 perfumes colliding in one enclosed hall. Cinnamon from the east, myrrh from Arabia, rose oil from gardens that once belonged to Persian kings. The scents cling to the silks draped over the marble columns and soak into the embroidered cushions scattered along the floor. Above it all, the hum of voices rises and falls like the tide, punctuated by bursts of laughter that sound a little too sharp to be carefree. The tables, if you can call them that, are low, carved from single slabs of dark wood, each inlaid with gold so polished it mirrors the faces leaning over it. You can barely see the surface for the platters piled high with roasted peacocks, honey-drizzled figs, and bowls of saffron rice. Each dish arrives with a little story from the servant carrying it. This bird was hunted in the royal gardens. This wine was shipped in amphorae from the islands Alexander conquered 2 years ago. Even the bread has its tale, kneaded from flour brought across mountains, just to remind the guests of the empire's reach. You sit among men who once wore only bronze and leather, now glittering in fabrics that catch the light with every gesture. They wear jewels in their hair, rings on every joint, and sandals stitched with silver thread. Some of these faces are Macedonian, weathered and scarred from years of campaigning. Others are smooth and foreign, Persians and Babylonians drawn into Alexander's inner circle. The talk drifts easily from military supply routes to the price of ivory, then into whispers about who might marry whose daughter to secure the next alliance. Here, a toast to the king's memory doubles as a negotiation over tax rights in a newly conquered province. Alexander himself used to dominate these rooms, sprawling on the central couch, wine cup in hand, his gaze moving like a blade between friend and foe. He'd call for musicians when he sensed tempers flaring and slip in a joke so outrageous that even enemies had to laugh. Now, his absence leaves a vacuum everyone pretends not to notice. The laughter comes too quickly, the toasts too often, as if gilded surfaces might hide the cracks beneath. You notice that when one man's cup is filled, another's is deliberately left waiting just a moment too long. The politics here are as layered as the banquets themselves. Beneath the polite conversation runs a current of suspicion. Men who once shared tents now measure each other by the territories they hold, the soldiers still loyal to them, the alliances they can forge with a single nod across the table. A spilled goblet is no accident. A seat at the far end is a message. And when a platter of roasted lamb is passed, the way it travels around the circle can tell you more about the state of the empire than any formal proclamation. Historians still wonder if these gatherings were truly about uniting Macedonian and Persian elites, or if they were simply theater, a lavish stage where Alexander could display the empire's wealth while keeping its most ambitious men close enough to watch. You can imagine him orchestrating every detail. The seating chart designed to provoke subtle rivalries, the rare dishes served to some and not others, the dancers weaving between couches with veiled faces and uncovered eyes. The wine, of course, flows endlessly, and with it the loosening of tongues. By the third round, a satrap from the east is boasting about the number of war elephants under his command, while a Macedonian general counters with the list of fortresses he's personally taken. Neither admits the truth that both are as vulnerable as they are powerful, their positions depending on the fragile balance left behind after Alexander's death. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a singer strums a lyre, her song about the king's victories, carrying just enough flattery to make everyone at the table feel they've been part of them. You find yourself watching the hands more than the faces. The casual way one man lets his fingers brush the hilt of a dagger at his side, another's habit of tapping his cup 3 times before drinking, a signal you've seen used between co-conspirators in darker corners. This isn't just a feast, it's a map of loyalties and betrayals, drawn in glances and half smiles, in the angle of a cup, in the direction of a servant's path. When the final course arrives, dates stuffed with almonds and drenched in honey, the air is thick with more than sweetness. Outside, the night presses against the open arches, warm and heavy. But inside, the tension is its own kind of heat. These banquets, you realize, aren't meant to relax anyone. They're meant to remind every guest of what's at stake and how quickly a seat at the table can be taken away. As the music softens and the courtiers recline deeper into their cushions, you catch a glimpse of a man at the far end, watching the room with a stillness that doesn't belong to the wine-drunk mood. His eyes are measuring, calculating, storing away every slip of the tongue and every insult disguised as a compliment. If Alexander's spirit lingers anywhere, it might be here, in the careful dance of power over plates of gold. Soon, the servants begin clearing the tables, their movements swift but silent, as though trained to remove more than just the dishes. The air feels lighter with each emptied platter, yet the taste of the evening lingers, thick with unspoken bargains. And as the last of the wine is poured and the laughter fades to murmurs, you realize that these banquets are less about food than about survival, an endless feast where the true courses are alliances and ambitions. From here, the night leads you into the quieter, more private spaces of the court, where luxury blurs into ritual and where even the simplest gesture might be freighted with centuries of meaning. It begins before dawn, when the torches still burn low and the world feels suspended between night and morning. The corridors of the palace are hushed, except for the soft shuffle of sandals on polished stone. Servants glide past carrying bowls of scented water, their eyes fixed on the floor, as if meeting the wrong gaze might draw divine disfavor. That's the thing about living under a man who calls himself a god. You never quite know which rules are mortal and which are carved in celestial stone. By the time the first sunlight spills across the marble courtyard, the rituals have already begun. You join the line of courtiers waiting to offer the day's first bow. For some, it's a deep, theatrical prostration, forehead nearly brushing the floor. For others, it's a measured dip of the head, the barest acknowledgement, wrapped in layers of political calculation. Alexander, or perhaps no, the god King Alexander, receives them with a gaze that could pass for warmth or judgment, depending on how much you've pleased him lately. His tunic is woven from fabric, so fine it catches the light like rippling water, and at his side hangs a sword that has ended both wars and friendships. The audience chamber itself is a theater of power. Golden lions crouch at the base of the throne, their eyes inlaid with gems that glimmer like living things. Behind him, great banners from conquered lands hang like trophies, their colors muted in the morning light, but their meaning unmistakable. Everything you see here belongs to him, and by extension, so do you. The air smells faintly of frankincense, a sacred scent meant to remind everyone that this is not merely a mortal audience, but a meeting with the divine. Throughout the day, edicts pass from his lips like oracles. A tax lifted here, a general reassigned there, a marriage arranged without so much as consulting the bride. Each command ripples outward, reshaping lives in places Alexander might never see. The odd thing is, he doesn't just seem to believe in his godhood. He expects you to believe it too, not as a metaphor or a courtly exaggeration, but as a living truth. To live under a god king is to let go of the idea that your life is fully your own. And yet, for all the grandeur, there's an intimacy to his rule that can be disarming. You might be summoned without warning to dine at his table, handed a cup of wine before you've even bowed. In those moments, he can be startlingly human, laughing, leaning in to tell you a story about a night in a far-off city, teasing you about a rumor you didn't know had spread. But just as easily, the mood can turn. A misplaced word, a joke that falls flat, and you're reminded of Cletus, the loyal general who once stood at such a table and didn't leave alive. Historians still debate whether Alexander's divinity was political theater or something he truly believed. Was it a shield against dissent, or did he carry in his heart the absolute conviction that Zeus himself had claimed him as a son? It's an open question, and living under his rule doesn't bring you closer to the answer. What you do learn is that belief, whether yours or his, is a currency, and withholding it can be as dangerous as treason. In the markets, the god king's presence is felt in subtler ways. Merchants weave blessings to Alexander into their sales pitches. Priests find omens in the flight of birds and declare them signs of his favor. And artisans shape coins with his profile, as if stamping his face onto metal could imprint it onto the world forever. Even children playing in the streets mimic the formal bows of the court, their small bodies dropping into the dust before a boy who pretends to hold a scepter. The divine image isn't just in the palace, it's stitched into the fabric of daily life. There's a paradox here that no one names out loud. The closer you are to the God King, the more precarious your position becomes. Those who live in his orbit burn brightly, favored and adorned, but they burn fast. Favor can fade in an afternoon, replaced by suspicion, or simply by the God King's shifting attention. The ones who last are those who know when to be seen and when to disappear, when to praise loudly and when to let the silence speak for them. Evening falls, and with it, the ceremonies of the night. The God King retreats to his private quarters, but the rituals don't stop. Priests chant invocations over torches that will burn until morning. Courtiers slip away to whisper in shadowed halls, their schemes masked by the sound of distant music. You find yourself staring at the stars beyond the palace walls, wondering if they look any different to a man who believes he belongs among them. And it's in that quiet, when the gold and incense are far behind you, that you feel the strange gravity of it all. Living under a God King is living in a world where one man's moods can shift the course of empires, where devotion is both shield and weapon, and where even your dreams aren't entirely your own. You fall asleep knowing that tomorrow will bring another bow, another command, another day in the long shadow of divinity. From here, the night turns to the questions that outlast even God Kings, the myths they leave behind, the riddles they never solved, and the fragments of truth buried in the dust of centuries. The banquet hall smells of cardamom and roasting lamb, a heady perfume that mingles with the sweetness of Persian wine. Gold braziers line the walls, their flames licking upward and casting light over tapestries that tell both Macedonian conquests and Persian victories, stitched side by side as if the threads could weave peace. Silk-robed attendants glide between low couches and long tables, their steps silent over rugs thick enough to swallow sound. Above it all, the air shimmers with the low hum of music, the metallic pluck of a Persian santur, blending with the deep, reedy tones of Aula's pipes from the west. Here, in the heart of Alexander's empire, every sense is pulled in two directions at once. The meats are seasoned with cumin and coriander, yet served alongside sharp Macedonian olives and crusts of bread still warm from ovens built to Greek design. The cups are Persian in shape, long-stemmed and heavy at the base, but the toasts follow Macedonian custom, shouted in a language that rolls thick and fast over the tongue. You cannot sit without feeling the collision, the press of a world that refuses to be just one thing anymore. Alexander reclines at the head of the hall on a gilded couch, a golden crater at his side, and beside him sits Roxana, her bracelets catching the firelight like molten rings. She smiles at him with the serenity of a queen, but her eyes watch the crowd the way a hunter watches the brush for movement. The guests are a blend of satraps and generals, philosophers and priests, merchants whose ships carry cinnamon and pearls, and war captains whose hands still smell faintly of iron. Persian courtiers wear flowing robes dyed in crushed cochineal. Macedonian officers prefer the short tunic and bare arms, their bronze armbands clinking when they raise a cup. When a toast is made in Alexander's honor, half the room bows their heads while the other half taps fists against their chests. The gesture is meant to honor him in both traditions, yet in practice, it divides the hall into two slow-moving tides. You can feel the invisible line between them, thin as a silk thread, yet sharp enough to draw blood if pulled. Between courses, a poet rises to recite verses in Persian, praising Alexander as a unifier of nations. His words ripple through the Eastern guests, like warm honey, but in the Western corner, the Macedonians exchange glances over their cups, their expressions unreadable. When the applause fades, a Macedonian bard answers with a rough, booming song of victory at Gaugamela, a reminder that the empire's roots are watered in conquest, not consensus. The servants clear the tables and bring in the next course. Pomegranates split open like jewels, honeyed dates glistening on silver plates, and roasted pheasants dressed in fig leaves. The flavors are rich and heavy, yet every bite feels laced with something unsaid. Conversation flows in two languages at once, each sentence translated and reframed, each pause stretched long enough for doubt to creep in. You recall hearing of the weddings at Susa, where Alexander wed Roxana and commanded 80 of his officers to marry Persian noble women in a single ceremony. He had hoped the unions would fuse East and West, binding loyalty by blood. Some guests here tonight were part of those marriages, seated now with their spouses, faces lit by fire and reflection. Yet behind the polite laughter, there is a stiffness in their posture, as if the vows were still fresh wounds. The musicians shift to a quicker rhythm, and dancers enter, men in Persian trousers, women in Macedonian chittens, their steps weaving patterns meant to symbolize unity. The audience claps along, but you can see the subtle differences in timing, the occasional falter when one tradition's movement does not quite match the others. It is a beautiful performance, but it is also a metaphor, harmony that requires constant adjustment, where one misstep can turn grace into stumble. Alexander watches with a small, almost private smile. He drinks, leans toward Roxana, says something only she can hear. His eyes sweep the hall, lingering briefly on each cluster of guests, as though weighing them on an invisible scale. The gold catches in his hair. The shadows cling to the hard line of his jaw. He is both host and judge, weaving together a feast that is as much about power as it is about food. A servant passes near you, refilling cups, and you notice the way the wine sloshes in the light. Dark red, the color of ripe cherries, but heavy like syrup. It is sweet at first taste, then sharp, the way alliances feel when the cup is put down and the words have been spoken. Across the hall, a Persian noble raises his cup high in a toast to Alexander's divine rule, and for a moment, the entire room lifts their drinks together. The gesture is perfect, unified, until the cups touch lips, and you see some drink deeply, while others only let the rim brush their mouths. By the time the last course is cleared, the air is thick with smoke from the braziers and the mingled perfumes of guests who have sat too long in close quarters. The musicians play softer now, letting the conversation settle into low murmurs. Outside the tall, arched windows, the night stretches over Babylon, its streets glowing faintly in lamplight, the river gleaming like a drawn blade. When you finally step into the cooler air beyond the banquet hall, the sounds of laughter and stringed instruments follow you, fading with every step down the long stone corridor. You carry with you the sense that what you witnessed tonight was not simply a feast, but a delicate balancing act, one man holding two worlds together by will alone. And as you leave the glow of the torches behind, the thought lingers that such a balance can only hold for so long before history tilts one way or the other, leading us into the final moments of this story. And that's where we'll leave it for tonight. From the dusty glare of a court, bowing to a mortal who called himself divine, to the flicker of torchlight on a drunken spear, from the grinding roar of stones dragged into the sea, to the quiet ripple of a river whispered to grant immortality. It's been a long, slow walk through the life of a man who stitched empires together with gold, blood, and belief. If you're still awake, thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. And if you drifted off somewhere between the oracle's riddle, the knot that shouldn't untie, and the banquet where cultures stared across gilded cups, that's perfectly fine too. That's really the whole idea. If you enjoyed this calmer, sleep-friendly journey through history, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more. And I'd love to hear where you're listening from and what time it was when you pressed play. Drop it in the comments, as it's always wonderful to see how far these quiet stories can travel. For now, I'll let the last wine cup rest on Alexander's table. The musicians fall silent in the Babylonian night, and the weight of his conquests settle gently back into the folds of history. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.